Kathryn Shively Meier is a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, teaching Civil War history and early American military history. In 2014, her first book, Nature's Civil War, won the Wiley Silver Prize for the best first book in Civil War history. Please welcome Kathryn Meier.
All right, so today I'm going to offer just a few words about the demobilization of Civil War armies and the homecoming of soldiers, and their experiences varied as much as you can imagine, considering there were over 3 million troops who had served the Confederacy and the Union. Demobilization technically began with Confederate surrenders, which occurred mainly from April 9th through June 23rd, 1865. Soldiers coming home faced many challenges, including poverty, social upheaval, war wounds, mental afflictions, and lingering illnesses such as malaria, diarrhea, and venereal diseases, which many of them then shared with their wives at home. There was no doubt that citizen soldiers would face immense challenges reintegrating into society, but top priority was nearly always getting home to their families and loved ones and resuming their lives after being separated for the long years of war. I'm going to talk first a bit about Confederate experiences, then I'll talk about Black and white Union soldiers' experiences coming home, and then I'll briefly talk about institutional support that was offered for these groups of soldiers at the state and federal level. So beginning with Confederate demobilization, though Confederate demobilization technically began with the surrenders, some Confederate soldiers had already begun to melt away from the ranks in early 1865 as they received word from their loved ones at home that the families were starving, their children, their wives were starving. So some soldiers deserted early, but for those Confederates present at the formal surrenders, which was about 330,000 or so, demobilization was extremely chaotic, their futures uncertain, because they had just been defeated. Soldiers were hungry as agriculture and industry had been targeted as part of the winning U.S. strategy. Union General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant even administered emergency rations to Lee's troops at the surrender as they left. And surrender terms were fairly generous, allowing Confederate soldiers in many cases to keep their horses and their livestock and make use of the few still operating railroads and steamships in the region. About 20% of Confederate soldiers were allowed to keep their arms, their small arms. This was to be for protection and for hunting purposes. The Confederate dollar, as you can imagine, had become worthless upon surrender. So many Confederate commanders attempted to pay their remaining troops with what little silver they had on hand, which often just amounted to a few cents. Upon parole, many Confederate soldiers made their ways home, their journeys sometimes taking weeks or months, considering the ravaged infrastructure and their own disabilities. Some came home to cities under Union occupation and martial law, such as Richmond. Other cities and towns were in complete ruin, making for a very depressing homecoming. Some Confederate veterans had to pass through hostile Unionist areas in the South, such as eastern Tennessee, in which the locals actually sent out the police to intercept Confederate soldiers and confiscate their weapons. Many of these Confederate soldiers actually swam the Tennessee River to escape the police. Confederates had pressing social issues on their minds, and political ones as well. The first concerned the collapse of slavery. Confederates were unsure if they were coming home to farms without laborers, and in their worst fears, perhaps a population of nearly 4 million formerly enslaved people who might seek a kind of revenge for the psychological and physical brutality they had endured under slavery. As one Confederate colonel wrote by the name of John Nadenbush, he wrote his wife to discuss their former slave Louise. Quote, "You will have to fix up Louise a little in clothing and take positive control over her." He was trying to re-envision how they could maintain their labor now that freedom had come. Over time, the U.S. Freedmen's Bureau instigated labor contracts between former masters and freed people, and in many cases, freed people were confined to their old plantations under the sharecropping system, revoking the promise of freedom in landholding for many black Southerners. The other concern facing Confederates was, would they be punished for treason? After all, they had rebelled and seceded and been defeated in the Civil War. So in the early months after surrender, Lincoln's replacement U.S. President Andrew Johnson offered few clues as to how rebels would be treated. He had inherited a chaotic situation of occupation on the ground from Lincoln after Lincoln's assassination. Some occupied areas were under military rule, some were under provisional governors, and some were in the process of electing new governments. So former Confederates, especially high-ranking military and civil authorities, were unsure whether they'd be tried and hanged, and some of them actually left the country. Just to give a few examples, General Jubal Early, former Vice President John C. Breckinridge were a few of the Confederates who temporarily left the country, and some left for good. They went to places like Cuba, Mexico, South America, Canada, and even Australia, creating, in effect, a Confederate diaspora around the world. Very interesting to follow the lives of those people. Others, like Robert E. Lee, remained in the South to face their fates, even if that meant trial or revoked citizenship. Over the next decade, most ex-Confederates would have their citizenship rights restored, and even regain some political control over their states after temporary periods of disfranchisement for some. Very few would be punished. Even Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, former Commander-in-Chief, only faced 2 years of imprisonment at Fort Monroe and was lumped under the pardons of Andrew Johnson's amnesty proclamation in 1868. We'll turn to the U.S. side to discuss some of the varied experiences there. On the U.S. side, there was approximately 1 million U.S. soldiers still in arms in spring of 1865. Demobilization was centrally organized and administered. In fact, mustering out was the first time the U.S. military really kept proper paperwork. Mustering out involved final payments, but payments were not given until the end of the mustering out process to prevent soldiers from spending their wares in immoral ways. This was a concern of the U.S. Army, so things such as gambling, prostitution, or falling prey to swindlers. Between May and November of 1865, 801,000 Union soldiers were efficiently and systematically mustered out. Union soldiers could retain their weapons for a small fee, $6 for their rifle muskets, $10 for Spencers, $3 for edged weapons. This helped to deal with the weapons surplus problem we've had at the end of every major American war. Then the two largest forces belonging to Generals Meade and Sherman participated in the so-called Grand Review in Washington, a 2-day celebratory parade on May 23rd and 24th, 1865, from which United States colored troops were excluded. They had to participate in their own segregated review in Pennsylvania later that year. This will be sort of a theme for the USCT. For U.S. troops arriving home appeared significantly more promising than in the Confederacy. Very little fighting had taken place on northern soil, meaning veterans were generally going home to strong economic growth. Indeed, the U.S. economy grew by 50% by the end of the war versus the Confederacy. Their economy declined by 60%. Still, many United States colored troops had come from the South. They had been in bondage before they self-emancipated and joined the United States Army. So they were returning to the uncertainty and joy of emancipation. 50% of enslaved families had been broken up by slave sale during the antebellum period, and so Those USCTs who returned home to the South mainly concerned themselves with reuniting themselves with their families, as did many freed people. All freed people needed new jobs and to construct new institutions, such as schools and churches, to support their new lives. The reality of Union demobilization is that it happened quickly for some, and for others, especially USCT units, sometimes much, much later, as a mass of Union soldiers had to oversee Reconstruction or were reassigned to the Texas-Mexico border, where a potential conflict was brewing with the French puppet government put in place by Napoleon III. The war with Mexico did not materialize, much to the chagrin of many ex-Confederate generals, by the way. They were hoping to even possibly participate in that war. But for many Union soldiers, occupation duty would linger on and on, perhaps until 1877, when US troops were withdrawn by President Rutherford B. Hayes. It should be noted that Union occupation grew smaller and smaller, waning to just 30,000 and then even fewer in the 1870s, spread out over an immense space of roughly 750,000 square miles. Americans on both sides expressed distaste for standing armies in peacetime. Talk a little bit about occupation for those soldiers who were stuck on occupation duty. During early occupation, the U.S. Army began to infiltrate rural places in the former Confederacy that had been untouched by the war, spreading emancipation to locations that hadn't even heard of emancipation. So they were acting as a freeing force, and many African Americans were delighted to see the U.S. Army come in and spread the news. Because the Freedmen's Bureau, the U.S. agency tasked with ushering freed people into new lives, was quite small, usually just around a couple of hundred agents. The Army helped administer freedom quite literally, for example, by holding military courts to assist Black Southerners in getting fair trials. I have a quote about this. As one USCT officer, Colonel William B. Johnson, explained in June of 1865, quote, "Honorable Benjamin Cheers of Tallahassee, if there ever was a demon in human form, he is one. The day before we came up," meaning the USCTs, "the day before we came up, he took one of his slaves, a boy of 12 years old, and laid upon his naked back 300 lashes. But thank God, today he stands awaiting his trial." And that trial was administered by the U.S. Army. U.S. soldiers also protected freed people from burgeoning violence from the paramilitary organizations cropping up across the South, such as the White League or the Ku Klux Klan. For instance, the Army found a number of Black bodies scattered in the South Carolina woods upon their entrance to that area. They also oversaw elections and helped to enroll Black voters after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870. Many white U.S. troops expressed extreme dissatisfaction with what they viewed as political rather than military responsibilities, as, remember, they were citizen soldiers, meaning they had come from civil society. They intended just to serve for the length of the war, and they wanted to go home. Some regiments even mutinied in this period. Black troops, however, expressed a sense of pride at helping to model and administer freedom to newly emancipated people. Okay, so there was a definite divide between Black and white troops and their feelings about occupation. I'm just going to talk a little bit about institutional support that was created on both sides to try to help veterans reintegrate into civilian life following the Civil War. On the U.S. side, it was federally administered, and on the Confederate side, state administered, and that's because the U.S. government did very little to help soldiers that they considered former traitors. Since the American Revolution, the U.S. federal government had provided some pensions for veterans, and after the Mexican-American War, even a federal soldier's home. So these things would be built upon here. It was the pension system authorized in 1862 by U.S. Congress and the 1865 bill for a national soldiers' home network that birthed the modern system we know today. The National Soldiers' Home became the VA in 1930, for instance. Also in 1866, U.S. Congress passed a law giving preference to veterans in government jobs. Okay, so this is all post-Civil War development, or even during the Civil War. National homes for soldiers were established in places like Augusta, Maine, Wisconsin, Ohio, Hampton, Virginia. These were decidedly rural places to protect soldiers from the vices of city life. Again, this is a theme we see, right? Protecting soldiers from their propensity to vices. These homes could serve as halfway houses where soldiers would stay until they got jobs, or they could reside there permanently receiving health care. Half to 2/3 of soldiers entered these homes because of disabilities, usually from disease, and 6 of 10 had no family ties. Otherwise, they might have been cared for at home. Even USCT veterans benefited from federal support such as pensions, though to lesser degrees. They could also stay in national homes, but they were segregated into separate quarters and mess halls. The former Confederacy had state-level, local, or privatized support for veterans, which arose a bit later after people began to recoup their financial situations. So this tended to be in the 1880s and 90s. All pensions were state-issued to Confederates, and the money that was given out was much less and to far fewer than in the Union. State assistance varied, but in Virginia, as early as January 1867, the legislature passed a bill to pay for the artificial limbs of veterans. Within 3 years, 330 artificial limbs had been distributed. For those here today who have been to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts grounds, you're also aware that the Confederacy had its own system of soldier homes for veteran care. These were local and privately funded. Indeed, Robert E. Lee Camp No. 1 on the VMFA grounds was created on February 25th, 1885, and operated until 1941, and it was the first long-term home established in the South of 16 others. Though both sides did develop some institutional support then for their soldiers, for their former soldiers over the long term, I do want to remark that problems of homelessness and poverty, sickness, debilitation did continue well into the turn of the century. And I wanted to close by briefly calling attention to those veterans who never returned home, those who died, which now historians estimate much higher than the old estimate of 620,000 deaths. Now, I'd average it somewhere around 750,000 upwards deaths of Civil War soldiers. 2/3 of those had died from disease, I should also mention. So both sides went to considerable lengths to locate and recover the bodies of their loved ones. So a large number of soldiers on both sides, their bodies were dug up, they were exhumed, and sent home if families could afford to do so and if they could find them. On the U.S. side, the United States Sanitary Commission helped to locate fallen soldiers and return them to their families. Many U.S. soldiers were then buried in national cemeteries like Arlington, which I might note was placed on confiscated land from Lee's wife's family. That's an interesting story. On the Confederate side, Ladies' Aid Memorial Associations, these were local groups of women, took up the project of locating and reburying the Confederate dead. So if you go to a place like Hollywood Cemetery, you're going to find a number of Confederate soldiers who died at Gettysburg, and you might ask yourself, well, how did these bodies get here? And that's because of the great efforts of family members and local aid groups to recover these bodies and bring them home. So it looks like I'm at just about 19 minutes here, and I'll go ahead and stop there for questions, but I did want to show you this other slide if you're interested in doing further reading on the demobilization of Civil War armies or the growth of things like the pension system These are some excellent titles. Gregory Downes' book, After Appomattox, is very new, and it's a highly regarded book on this topic. So feel free to jot those down for further reading if you're interested. And at this point, I will turn it over to the audience for questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the Unionist enclave in Eastern Tennessee.
Yeah.
Can you comment briefly about that?
So during the Civil War, there were pockets of what we call Unionists, and those are people who were opposed to secession. And Abraham Lincoln thought they existed in a lot larger numbers than they actually did. He had this kind of philosophy throughout the war that really secessionists were just a few, and that they had duped the rest of the population who were just loyal U.S. citizens waiting to come home. Well, in fact, there were pockets. The pockets of Unionist populations within the Confederacy tended to be areas that had been cut off from slavery economically. So they were areas where there were very
few. Ladies and
few.
gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? There will be a walking tour in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln at 1 o'clock. The tour will not be here. It will be held at 17th and Dock Streets. If you're interested, it is 17th and Dock Streets at 1 o'clock.
Okay, so Eastern Tennessee was one of those areas that was economically detached from slavery. The most famous during the Civil War is, of course, Western Virginia, which seceded from secession because Western Virginians were so cut off from the economy, the slave economy. They were much more tied in with Pennsylvania. So for that reason, they resented the taxation disparity. They felt that they were extraordinarily taxed within the Confederacy because of their lack of slaves. And so they reached out to Abraham Lincoln, and West Virginia came about as a new state in 1863 once they agreed to emancipation. So there was a number of enclaves, but it's a great question. Other questions? Yes?
What about all the POWs? What happened to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. POWs also had to be demobilized, and for many POWs, it took a lot longer to get home. So Union POWs were contained in Confederate POW camps, and that meant they had to rely on the Confederate broken infrastructure to get home. There was a famous explosion on a steamboat, the Sultana, so it was very difficult for Union POWs to get home. On the Confederate side, they were in POW camps that were sometimes in the Midwest, Illinois, Indiana. Again, a considerable distance for people to get home without funds. So for POWs, much more difficult in terms of distance covered. Furthermore, they were often starving. They were extremely sick. And as many of you know, POWs after the Civil War in many cases looked like concentration camp victims. They were so starved. So if you look at photographs of them, that's what it will recall to your mind. POWs became an issue of extreme volatility and emotional anger on both sides, as both sides accused each other of atrocities in failing to feed their prisoners of war. So for those men, it was a very difficult and stark situation getting home. Great question. Any other questions? Yes?
But wouldn't the whole process also be complicated by the fact that some areas didn't know the war was over until weeks or months after other areas knew about it?
Yeah, so Confederate surrenders happened in a kind of ripple effect. And even though in the popular consciousness, people like to look at Lee's surrender as the surrender, in fact, it was not the surrender. The biggest surrender was between Sherman and Joseph Eggleston Johnston in North Carolina, and then more surrenders followed. And in some cases, the last Confederate general to surrender, besides the strange incident of the CSS Shenandoah, which didn't strike its colors until November of 1865, just went around harassing Union merchant ships for months. But besides that strange scenario, the last Confederate general to surrender was actually a Cherokee general, General Standwatie. And he was out in the Trans-Mississippi Theater closer to Indian Territory. And his reasons for not surrendering had to do with his own hopes that he would be able to get something out of the Civil War for his people, the Cherokee people, who had been removed several decades earlier to an area that was not their home, and they had been out there starving and experiencing sort of a terrible life. So he was hoping that by hanging on, he'd be able to extract some kind of more generous surrender terms from the Union side, which did not happen. In fact, they said, "You're a traitor." Many Cherokee natives actually served the Union, so too bad for you, you get nothing. So it was a ripple effect, and it was very complex, you're correct. Any other questions?
Thank
All right,
you very
thank you.
much. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you.